Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Reinhard and I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida. I'm going to be talking today about constraining Axion inflation with DESI Galaxies, and this talk will be based on work that was done in this paper that's on arXiv with collaborators Zach Slepian, Jiamin Hu, and Alessandro Greco. And a tool that's very commonly used in cosmology to study large-scale structure are the endpoint correlation functions. So I have some nice pictures of those down here. They study the endpoint galaxy correlation functions, quantify the excess clustering of n number of galaxies over and above a random distribution. And we're going to use the 4-point correlation function to search for the signal of axion inflation. So DESI stands for the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. It is a fiber-fed spectrograph that is on the Mayol telescope. This image on the right is a piece of the DESI focal plane, which has these robotic fiber positioners that hold these optical fibers. They swivel around and point at different galaxies, record the spectrum, and from the spectra, the distance can be inferred to those galaxies. So DESI is the largest galaxy redshift surveyed to date. It will observe more than 30 million galaxies by the time that it's done. And so the focus of this conference is parity violation. And so a parity transformation is a mirror reflection plus an 180-degree rotation about the plane of the mirror. So if we look at our right hand in the mirror, it looks like a left hand, right? And of course, we can't rotate our right hand into a left hand. They're related by mirror reflection or a parity transformation. And there's some recent evidence that there may be parity violation in the large-scale structure of matter. So in 2022, there were papers put out by Jiamin Hu and collaborators and Oliver Philcox that both reported evidence of parity violation in the large-scale structure at different statistical significances. They used the BOSS data, the Baryon Oscillation Spectroscopic Survey, which was contained about 1 million galaxies. And a more recent analysis was done by the DESI collaboration just a couple months ago. So Slepian et al. Found evidence of parity violation at about 10 sigma when they did a autocorrelation analysis, but the signal disappeared when they did a cross-correlation analysis. So the jury really is still out on whether this is a real signal. So all of these different analyses measured parity violation by measuring the 4-point correlation function, which is the simplest statistic sensitive to parity violation. So the galaxy 4-point correlation function is the excess clustering of quartets of galaxies over a random distribution. And in practice, this is measured by calculating the ensemble average of these galaxy over densities delta. These measure the deviation of the density from the average at some particular spatial location. And performing this integral is like adding up all possible different galaxy tetrahedra. So what do I mean by a galaxy tetrahedron? So if we look at this tetrahedron on the left, we think of sitting on a single galaxy. That'll be the red dot up here, our primary galaxy. And we pick 3 other galaxies, and we draw vectors to the other 3 galaxies, which with R1 being the vector to the closest, R2 the vector to the next closest, and R3 the vector to the furthest of the other 3. And if we trace around this tetrahedron moving from R1 to R2 to R3, we move in a clockwise fashion. But if we look at the mirror reflection of this tetrahedron on the right, and we trace around that from R1 to R2 to R3, we move in a counterclockwise fashion. these two tetrahedra have different handedness, and they're related by a parity transformation. So this calculation of the 4-point function, if you find unequal numbers of right-handed and left-handed galaxy tetrahedra, that indicates that you have parity violation, and the large-scale structure is not invariant under mirror reflection. So if true, this is really a surprise because the force primarily responsible for the formation and evolution of the large-scale structure is gravity, and gravity is parity-even. So the source of parity violation may very well be some new physics from early on in the universe, potentially during the period of inflation. So inflation was a period of extremely rapid expansion in the very early universe, and it was driven by a scalar field known as the inflaton field, which we denote phi. And inflation occurs because the potential energy of the inflaton field dominates its kinetic energy. So we represent the inflaton field slowly rolling down its potential. So when it's slowly rolling and the kinetic energy is small, inflation occurs, but as it rolls down the hill, kinetic energy picks up, it gets larger, and inflation ends outside of this gray region. We can think of the inflaton field as some homogeneous background value plus small perturbations on that background, and it's these small perturbations that provide the initial seeds for structure formation. So the simplest models of single scalar field inflation don't have parity violation, but there are alternative models of inflation which do have parity violation built in. So I've been focused on one such model known as Axion inflation, where the axion, the scalar field phi, it's a pseudoscalar, and it plays the role of the inflaton. It drives the expansion of space. And in this model, we have another field, a mu, a U1 gauge field, analogous to the electromagnetic 4 potential, but it's a general U1 gauge field, so not necessarily associated with electromagnetism. So in our action, we have the Einstein-Hilbert action, we have gravity, the kinetic term for these two fields, and an interaction term between the axion and the gauge field, and the potential energy of the axion. Now the fluctuations in the inflaton field in this model, they can be due to vacuum fluctuations, but also we get fluctuations due to this inverse decay process where we have gauge field quanta represented in red here, which combine and produce axion field quanta. So these fluctuations in the axion field, according to Einstein's equation, they correspond to perturbations in the curvature of spacetime. And we call these curvature perturbations, which we'll return to in a moment. So where's the parity violation really coming from in this model? So this equation up here is the equation of motion for the gauge field mode functions. And we have a plus and a minus corresponding to the two different helicities. You can think of them as corresponding to like a right-handed or a left-handed photon. And tau represents conformal time. So as tau goes to minus infinity, we're very early on at the beginning of inflation, and this term goes to 0. So early on, both of the A plus and A minus modes obey the equation of a simple harmonic oscillator, and they are equally produced. But later on, this term becomes prominent, and the A plus modes actually become suppressed, and the A minus modes are exponentially produced. So we have hugely different numbers of the right and left-handed gauge quanta. So this is really where the parity violation in this model is coming from. So ultimately, we want to search for the signal in the DESI data. We said to do that, we would use the 4-point correlation function. So we need to compute the 4-point correlation function during inflation for this model. And we do that in Fourier space, in which case we call it the trispectrum. So the perturbations in the inflaton field we can write in Fourier space in terms of these mode functions Q. And the curvature perturbations that we mentioned before can also be written in terms of these mode functions. Now, it turns out that the only parity-odd piece of the 4-point function, the only possible term that could contribute is when we have 4 of these inverse decay mode functions, in which case we get these integrals of these Green's functions against these source terms, where we take the expectation value of these source terms. Now, this includes a lot of different contractions of the creation annihilation operators contained in these source terms, and we end up getting 48 different diagrams. So to get the different diagrams, we have 4 different vertices with our external wave vectors k1 to k4, and we have our loop momenta q1 to q4, which are always our blue line represents one single loop momentum, and the red line is sort of like a compound momentum where we have the external wave vector and the loop momentum. So if you look at all the different ways of combining the internal lines, you get 4 different types of diagrams. We call these connection structures. And we choose one of the diagrams of each connection structure that we call reference diagrams. And when you contract the creation annihilation operators, you get these delta functions for the different reference diagrams. Now, what's useful about describing things in this way is that we can compute the result for only these 4 different reference diagrams, and for any diagram with the same connection structure as a given reference diagram, all we have to do is permute the external momenta, the k1 to k4, to get that other diagram. We just take the final result, permute the momentum, and we can get the result for any of the other diagrams. So we really just have to compute these 4. We can permute the external momenta to get the other results. So when you compute these integrals, you integrate over the 4 loop momenta, and you have several delta functions. And so if you just integrate over those delta functions, you get this delta function here with the sum, enforcing that the sum of the momenta is 0. And you get this very complicated integral over one of the loop momenta. And as far as I know, nobody has been able to do this analytically. If we think about doing it numerically, we're integrating over, let's see, we have 4 external momenta, but really this enforces that one of them is dependent on the other. So really we have 3, each of them with 3 components. So that's 9. We also have 4 conformal time, tau 1 to tau 4. So that's 13. And we're doing a 3-dimensional integral. So we're doing a 3D integral on a 13-dimensional grid of numbers. So that's like a 16-dimensional integral, let's say. So this is very computationally intensive. So a couple of groups have computed it numerically just for a couple different configurations of wave vectors, but we really want to explore the whole parameter space of wave vectors to be able to search for this signal in the DESI data. So instead of integrating over all those delta functions, what we do instead is we write them as an integral over a complex exponential, and then we expand these complex exponentials using the plane wave expansion. And then you can recognize that these integrals become convolutions. So if we use the convolution theorem, we can write them as a sequence of Fourier transforms. And we were able to do all the angular parts of the Fourier transforms analytically, and that just leaves us with the radial integrals, which are highly non-trivial. So the end result for reference diagram 1 looks like this, where this tau really contains all our integrals, and that's defined down here. So it may still look fairly complicated, and it is, But at worst, we have 6-dimensional integrals here, where before we had a 16-dimensional integral. So it's really a huge improvement on the numerical cost. So what I've been focusing on since doing that analytical work is trying to do the rest of the integrals numerically. These curly I integrals are defined over here, and this is what I've been working on most recently, writing code to compute these integrals, which is already getting to be a bit of a issue for my laptop because we're integrating u over a grid of 3 numbers, k, x, and x prime. So if each of these is an array with 1,000 points, we're already doing an integral on a grid of a billion numbers. I've written code already to numerically compute this curly m integral, which is given down here. And notice this contains these 2 spherical Bessel functions. And this m also actually contains a third spherical Bessel functions, and these are highly oscillatory. So if these integrals go from 0 to infinity, and minus infinity is 0, but when you numerically integrate, you have to cut off the integration range somewhere. And we saw that when we did a sharp cutoff, we got this ringing effect known as Gibbs ringing. So we had to apply an exponential smoothing to get rid of this ringing effect. So this is some of the things I've been working on recently. So the next steps are to finish this numerical computation of the 4PCF for Axion inflation, or I should say the trispectrum, since we're in Fourier space. Then we'll need to evolve that forward in time using the transfer function, take the inverse Fourier transform to obtain the Galaxy 4-point correlation function. One of the issues of the previous analyses done of the parity-odd 4PCF is the number of degrees of freedom. But since we'll have our Axion inflation Galaxy 4PCF model, we can rank the Galaxy tetrahedra by the highest signal to noise ratio, and we can include only those highest signal to noise configurations in our analysis. So this should greatly improve our estimate of the covariance matrix when we're searching for the signal of this model. So ultimately, we will measure the parity-odd 4-point correlation function with DESI Galaxies and search for the signal of Axion inflation. So thank you for listening to my talk and looking forward to seeing everyone at the conference.